When you're diagnosed with cancer, work might be the last thing on your mind. But the decisions you make early on about time off, disclosure, accommodations can have a lasting impact. In this episode, we explore what it means to work while living with cancer, from juggling treatment and deadlines to managing side effects during the workday. Joanna Doran, CEO of Triage Cancer, breaks down workplace protections like the Americans with Disabilities Act and explains how her organization helps people understand their rights and advocate for themselves. Whether you're working through treatment, taking leave, or deciding how much to share, this conversation's about making informed choices with less stress and more support. You're listening to Kidney Cancer Unfiltered, Episode 6. Hi, Joanna. Thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. For our listeners who are probably very interested in the topic of cancer at work, can you introduce yourself and kind of what you do in your position?
Sure. I'm Joanna Doran. I'm the CEO of Triage Cancer. And Triage Cancer is a national nonprofit organization that provides free education on all of the legal and practical things that can come along with a cancer diagnosis. And so we provide free education through educational events for patients, caregivers, and anyone else. And then we also have lots of materials and resources on these topics, as well as a free legal and financial navigation program to answer people's individual questions.
Great, thank you. And I'm so glad that you had the time to join us because this is a topic I think many cancer survivors, not just kidney cancer survivors, think about and is probably not talked enough about, honestly. So I'm glad we're having this conversation because I know for myself, I've had cancer twice. I've had 2 medical leaves, and trying to navigate that process while holding a full-time job had been very complicated, not even just logistically, but just so to get into it from the logistical point of view, when someone is first diagnosed with cancer, what should be their first step when thinking about work?
Even though it's not the thing that most people think about first, we really would say ideally someone should think about getting an understanding of all of their rights and what their specific options are through their employer. Because unfortunately, what we see is that people make decisions in really a crisis moment
Yes.
and they don't really understand sometimes the long-term implications of those decisions or even knowing that there was something available to support them. And so they make decisions that they wouldn't have if they had known about their rights or what other types of options are available to them.
So, speaking of rights and options, what legal protections exist in the United States for people with cancer who are still working?
There are actually lots of different types of legal protections. So there are laws that we call fair employment laws, which protect people against discrimination at work based on their medical condition. And those laws exist at the federal level, like the Americans with Disabilities Act or the ADA, but they also exist at the state level. And sometimes the state laws are actually more protective than the federal law. So we really encourage people to not just know what their federal rights are, but to also understand their state or local rights. And in addition to protecting people against discrimination, those fair employment laws also give people access to reasonable accommodations. And that is really just a technical phrase for saying you get help. You get help at work to do your job, and that can take lots of different formats. And then there are laws that allow us to take time off work. And those laws we refer to as leave laws.
Yeah.
And again, those could be at the federal level, like the Family and Medical Leave Act or the FMLA, but they could also exist at the state level or even maybe the county or city level. And so again, it's a good example of a place where you want to know all of the things that are available to you so that you can understand how to best navigate all of those options and make your best choice.
Now, this, I'm not sure if I'm going to articulate this right, but I know that it is a conversation that I've had with people is understanding kind of how cancer fits into the ADA or into other laws, because often we don't think of cancer as a disability, right? We don't think of it as a chronic condition depending on the type of stage and advanced cancer you have. So can you just maybe in a quick bit just kind of break down how cancer fits into those laws?
That's a great question. And we do hear that a lot. A lot of people who have a cancer diagnosis think that they don't qualify for protection under some of these laws that talk about disability. And so it's important to know that all the laws and programs that we talk about have a different definition of disability. And we never say that everyone with a vision impairment, for example, has a disability. We always look at it under the law on an individual basis. So we look specifically at how somebody's medical condition is impacting them specifically. So when we talk about the ADA defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So there's a couple parts to that. First, you have to have a medical condition. The second is that it's impacting a major life activity, and that impact has to be substantial. So it can't be something that's mildly annoying or something that happens once in a while. It has to be a substantial impact on a major life activity. And major life activities are major. So things like breathing and walking and talking and eating. But it also includes concentrating or sleeping or the operation of major bodily functions. So when we talk about cancer and the way that cancer treatments often cause side effects that impact those things, like sleeping and concentrating and the operation of major bodily functions, someone with a cancer diagnosis can qualify as having a disability under the ADA and be protected.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that because again, it's a very nuanced thing, and it's complicated, as you know. It's a complicated thing for any medical diagnosis, really, to just kind of navigate like existing at work in that way. So, how do people usually decide? I know for myself, so I should probably like preface this question, right? I know for myself. I only had, or rather, I shouldn't say only. My treatments were surgery, so for me, it was pretty easy to be like, okay, I need to leave. I need it for this certain amount of time, knowing what my recovery is, and then I'll go back to work after this certain period. And then I had to take leave for radioactive iodine, and that was a pretty like easy decision to be like, okay, I'll take 2 weeks leave and then go back to work. Um, but not everyone's cancer is like that. Not everyone's kidney cancer is stage one or in early stages where surgery or is the treatment. So how do people usually decide whether to keep working, take a break, leave their job entirely after diagnosis? What are some of both the emotional and practical considerations that people have to make or take into account, actually?
I think those types of decisions are incredibly personal and lots of different factors go into those decisions. So I think a lot of times when you focus on the practical side of it, it may be what somebody has access to in terms of legal protections and also those employer policies. So if somebody has a job that they work for a smaller employer, so maybe some of the laws like the FMLA don't apply. If they have an hourly job that's really physical, they might not have access to paid leave. They might not have access to the legal protections that keep your job protected. They might not have access to health insurance even through their job. So in that circumstance, someone might feel like, well, maybe I need to take time off work instead of trying to work through treatment. And if they happen to live in a state that has state disability insurance, that might be a factor that would lead them towards taking disability benefits. So it really, I think, does depend on what somebody has access to, because those are factors that will help in somebody's decision-making process. If you look at more of the emotional side, we often find that healthcare professionals make a lot of assumptions about patients and say things like, oh, well, just go out on disability, as if that's something that everybody has access to, because not everybody does have access to that. But some people actually like their jobs. Some people find that as a source of even distraction from dealing with their health so that they can focus on something else. Some people find their support system at work. So those are some of the more emotional aspects of making decisions about, do you want to try to work through treatment or not? Certainly, there are medical conditions and jobs that prevent people from actually working through treatment. So it is going to be specific to that individual and really what treatment they're having and how their treatment is impacting them, and then also their job responsibilities. So, if they have a very physical job and they are being substantially impacted by their treatment and their side effects can't be accommodated, that might be a factor to actually take time off work.
Now, to the point of disability. So I was able to go on leave because I'm privileged enough through my job to have a short-term disability benefit. The first time around when I had kidney cancer and I just had surgery as treatment, being able to get that approved, I would say, relatively easy. My doctor knew how long I had to be on it, and we got the approvals. The second time around, though, it was a lot more difficult because I had a physician who didn't understand that, recovering from thyroid cancer treatment is not just having the surgery, having your thyroid removed, but it's also adjusting to, medication, and it's a little bit longer of a recovery. And so that was a lot more difficult. And I have a point to saying this. I'm setting it up. But that was a lot more difficult because I didn't have an understanding physician and I had to like go through other ways to get the leave that I needed. And I say that to say, so when someone like myself or another person who's kind of faced in that second situation where they have access to short-term disability, but getting the approvals they need or having a compassionate physician who's like, okay, I understand how much leave that you want and you need for recovery. It's just a difficult process. Where can they go to get that support that they need? Like an advocate, if you will, not obviously not just caregivers, but like a financial advocate or a legal advocate. Where can they go for that?
So at Triage Cancer, I mentioned we have our legal and financial navigation program, and that's where anybody can call us. So we have patients call us directly. We have caregivers call on behalf of people who they're caring for. We have healthcare professionals call to ask us questions on behalf of their patients. So you can contact us and we can talk through the situation and the details of it and where there seems to be a breakdown in communication. And sometimes we can offer some practical suggestions on how to manage that. But I would say generally, a lot of the challenges we see related to employment come from places of ignorance
Yeah.
and really not understanding and assumptions that get made. And there's a lot of opportunity to provide education. So, unfortunately, for patients, that might be education of your employer
Yeah.
about what their obligations are under the law, or even understanding cancer and what a cancer diagnosis looks like for you individually.
Mhm.
But also, it might be education of your healthcare team. And that might be about explaining the side effects that you're experiencing in your job responsibilities and how you're struggling. Because I think that it's also important for healthcare teams to understand more holistically the challenges that patients might be experiencing. But if you find yourself in a situation where one member of your healthcare team, like maybe your physician, is having trouble understanding, there might be other members of the healthcare team that can provide additional context, or might be able to facilitate that communication. And so that might look like a financial navigator, but it could also be a social worker or a nurse or somebody else on the healthcare team who you can talk to about the side effects you're experiencing and the challenges you feel like you're facing at work, to be able to better explain why there's a need for that medical certification so that you can get access to what you need at work. And that might be medical leave, it might be a reasonable accommodation, and it might be applying for disability benefits.
Now, even just being able to say that you have cancer, right? Like actually telling people at work about your diagnosis. Um, Now for myself, the first time I told a small group of people, and then that was like my boss and my dotted line manager and a couple other people, but I kept the leave and the reason why quiet. But the second time around, a lot more people knew. It was more, I was more comfortable explaining why I was going on leave because at during that time I became a very vocal cancer advocate. People knew I grew closer. But the first time around, it was very difficult for me to decide, like, do I tell more than them? So what are some ways you've seen people, or like in conversations with survivors, like they decide who to tell at work about their diagnosis and when?
I think disclosure, like making decisions about whether or not you're going to stay at work or take time off or return to work or leave work entirely, disclosure at work is also a very personal decision, and everybody feels very differently about it. So I've had people tell me, there's no way I want to work somewhere where I can't disclose my
Yeah.
diagnosis. And then on the other hand, I've had people tell me I absolutely don't want to share my medical condition at work because I'm concerned about how it's going to impact my career and
Yeah.
how I'll be treated differently at work. And that comes from lots of different places as well. It might be that they've seen how their employer has treated other people with medical conditions, or even as a caregiver. So that might be things to take into consideration. So what does your environment at work look like? Is it a large employer or a smaller employer? And how do the laws apply to that employer? So if it's a smaller employer and there aren't fair employment laws that apply to that employer, then you lose some of those protections. So you might feel less comfortable disclosing information. But if somebody does decide they want to disclose, there are laws that provide protections for some employers, and you still have an opportunity to have some control over that disclosure process. So you can decide how much you want to disclose and to who you want to disclose. And the timing of that disclosure is a factor as well. So, it's interesting in the cancer community, we've always gotten the impression based on conversations we've had with individuals who've been diagnosed that they feel a responsibility to share their medical condition with their employer, which doesn't exist in other types of medical conditions. Like, we don't walk into a brand new job and be like, by the way, I've got high cholesterol, I've got high blood pressure, I have diabetes. People don't feel like they have to disclose that information, but there is something interesting about a cancer diagnosis where people feel sometimes an obligation to share, even when there isn't one.
Yeah, that I would say I somewhat had that feeling, even though I didn't really disclose the first time around. It's just kind of like this, I don't want to say knee-jerk reaction, that's not the right term, but it's just kind of like this deep thing of like, oh, I should tell people that this is what's wrong with me, if you will. But I wanted to go back to leave and protections and kind of finding an advocate to help. Another experience I had, and I'm sharing my own because maybe there are people like listeners who can kind of relate to what I had went to. But the first time around, I went on a 3-month leave because it does take a while to recover from, an abdominal surgery for kidney cancer. But I very much felt the pressure to go back early on my leave. I didn't. I didn't at all because I knew what my rights were, but I know that that's not the case for everybody. They may know what their rights are, but they may not feel strong enough to stay to their leave, or they may not know their rights and think, oh, well, I'm being pressured to go back to work. I have to go back to work. How do people work around, like, how do people navigate that feeling that they need to be back at work that is being put on them by their bosses or coworkers, whoever it may be?
Yeah, well, there's definitely a legal side to that and a practical side. So the legal side to that is it's incredibly important to know what your rights are so that you understand how much time you're entitled to time off that is job protected. And then to also understand that you have return to work rights that are protected in those circumstances, but also that employers are even restricted in how they can communicate with you when you're on leave. And they're not supposed to be hounding you about when you can come back to work. And so understanding how the law provides those protections, but also that under those laws, you're entitled to that leave and you can't be retaliated against for taking that leave. And so the employers can't make negative decisions against you because you're taking that leave, like under the FMLA. On the practical side, that doesn't necessarily solve the issue of feeling worried about how it might protect your job, or the fact that not every employer is going to follow the law. And so what do you do in the situation where you feel like you're being pressured or hounded to come back to work? Or if you don't there are going to be ramifications for your job and your career. And so there isn't a great answer there, except that it maybe comes back to communication, because sometimes it is about miscommunication, or maybe a supervisor who doesn't understand what the legal requirements are. And so I think starting from a place on the practical side of what's causing the feeling. So is it just like my own internal anxiety about going back to work? Or is it coming from the fact that my employer is calling me every day asking when I'm coming back to work? Or is it that, there's a big promotion coming up and I'm worried that I won't be considered for the promotion if I'm not there at work, or, it sort of depends on the facts of the situation. And so trying to take a step back and thinking about, why do I feel pressured? And could it be something where a conversation could be had about kind of what's going on, or explaining like, this is my plan for coming back to work, or anything that can try to address some of those assumptions or miscommunication or really ignorance about what the law provides. If you can head off those problems, that's the goal. And that's really what we try to do at Triage, is to provide that education and some of those practical solutions to avoid the downstream kind of legal challenges where your only remedy left is to actually sue an employer.
Yeah.
Because frankly, that's not a very practical solution, especially if you want to keep the job that you have right now. And so that's why starting from knowing what the law says and what your rights are, and then trying to understand the practical, sometimes emotional nature of what's going on, and trying to solve it that way, can be more useful than filing a lawsuit. But sometimes that's necessary too.
Yeah. And that I think ties into this, my question about legal misconceptions, and not just legal misconceptions, but just misconceptions about people navigating cancer at work. We know that President Biden, he had a recent prostate cancer diagnosis. And I know I noticed on social media, there's a lot of people tying into his ability to have run or been president for 4 years. And that's just like a public example. But I see things like that a lot on social media whenever there's like talk of cancer, or within, the cancer community online, this idea that if you have cancer, you can't really work, or you can't work well, or if you go through treatment, you won't be able to work as well anymore. And so what are some, and so those are more like, societal kind of misconceptions, but what are some of those common misconceptions people have when navigating cancer at work?
I think it does go back to those assumptions piece about, we sometimes talk about, there's a lot of assumptions that need to be battled. And the first is actually from the patient. So for someone who's been diagnosed with cancer, sometimes they assume, oh, well, I can't possibly work during treatment and there's nothing that could help me. And so that's why we also want to educate patients about where the law does provide protections and where there are programs like disability insurance so that they can manage those decisions, because everybody's going to make decisions differently for themselves. And it's going to be based on their medical condition and how their treatment is affecting them and their job responsibilities. But we also see those assumptions from employers where they just assume like, oh, this individual has cancer, there's no way they could work. As if cancer is one medical condition and everybody gets the same treatment and everybody reacts the same way to treatment. And that isn't the case. And so sometimes people make those assumptions, even from a place of being well-intentioned. So when we talk about fair employment protections and how people end up being discriminated at work, sometimes it's well-intentioned, where someone might say like, oh, we're not going to assign this project to this individual because they've got a lot on their plate. Or we're not going to promote them because they've got too much going on right now. So they're trying to do it like in a good way, I suppose, of like not overwhelming their employee, but they're making employment decisions based on somebody's medical condition. And that's really the bottom line of the ADA, is to provide that kind of protection.
Now, we're focusing a lot on the United States, but globally, what do protections look like globally? Like, how do they differ? And are there countries doing this particularly well and some that are not doing it as effectively?
That's actually a really interesting question. It really every country is very different in this regard because there are all different types of laws and protections. So I would say that the US is a leader globally around protections for people with disabilities, and that the ADA was a model for many other countries' disability protections. So in that regard, there are good employment protections under the ADA. I think there are always ways to improve laws to make sure people aren't falling through the cracks, but globally speaking, that's a really good example. There are other countries that do have similar protections. I think where other countries really excel is in what we refer to as social supports.
Hmm.
So where employees have access to paid leave, for example, which we don't have federally in the United States. Employees, even caregivers, have access to paid family leave. Or are there disability insurance programs that support someone when they need to take time off due to their medical condition? So I think that that's a place where the US has opportunity to improve the way that they're supporting employees with cancer by providing access to paid family and medical leave that many other countries do.
Now, we talked about leave in a few different ways. For our listeners who may not necessarily be as familiar with the different types of leave, can you just quickly break down the difference between like short-term disability, long-term disability, FMLA, and like other types of leave that we have access to?
Absolutely. So the Family and Medical Leave Act, or the FMLA, is a federal law, but it only applies to larger private employers and then state and local governments and the federal government. So if you work for a private employer with fewer than 50 employees, the FMLA doesn't actually apply to you. So about 50% of people in the United States don't have access to the FMLA in terms of taking time off. But the FMLA is unpaid leave. As I was mentioning, it's not paid leave. So it creates job protection and health insurance protection if you get your health insurance through your job, but it's unpaid. And most people can't afford to take the 12 weeks off that it provides without any income coming in. And that's really where disability insurance comes in. And there's three main ways that people get disability insurance. They're either getting it through their state. There are 5 states in Puerto Rico that offer state disability insurance programs where you pay into the system through your taxes. But if you don't have access to that, then you'd be looking at private disability insurance, which is something you either buy directly from an insurance company, which frankly, most people in the United States don't do, or they get access to it as an employee benefit, where their employer is offering either a short or long-term policy or both. So short-term disability is typically 6 months to a year, whereas the long-term disability policy is typically for medical conditions that are going to last a year or longer. And then if you do have a disability that's expected to last long-term, there's also the 2 federal programs, which are supplemental security income, which is based on your low income level, and then Social Security disability insurance, which is based on your work history and that you have paid into the retirement system over your work history. So there are some different ways people can tap into disability insurance, and the definition of disability is different across all of those options. So not everybody is going to qualify for all those options.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. And now I want to kind of go back to disclosing your diagnosis at work. What are some ways that people can share the news that feels empowering rather than vulnerable? I know that that's something both times, even if I was a little bit more open the second time around, but still both times it was just still a very vulnerable thing because it's a diagnosis, it's your life, it's your body kind of, betraying you, if you will, and it's just a lot and overwhelming. So what are some ways that we can share our diagnosis without feeling, I guess, too vulnerable or exposed?
I think sharing medical information is vulnerable. It makes people feel that way. I think that thinking through how you want to disclose and who you want to disclose to and how much and the timing are all opportunities to sort of take control of the situation and also control the narrative. And sometimes also as you do that, that can impact how people react to the news. So if you know, walk into a staff meeting and you just announce, I have cancer, that might feel less empowering.
Yeah.
Then if you decide, I'm going to tell these specific people, this is the information that I want to share. And I also want to share information about how I'm doing,
Mm.
because that sometimes can control the narrative. So if you are in a situation where you've taken some time off and you're coming back to work and you feel like you can do your job at 100%, maybe that's something you actually want to share, because that can help control the reaction sometimes and how people are going to react to that information. So if you're positive about it, then the reaction might be positive. If you do need support at work, laying out a plan for how you need that support might also control the reaction. Because if you can lay out a plan and show that you're being kind of proactive in what you would like to have happen, that makes it easier for an employer to respond back to you positively and say, like, that sounds like a good plan. As opposed to if you share the information as if you're presenting a problem to the
Mm.
employer that the employer has to solve. So how you share information, if you decide you want to do that, can also control the reaction and feel more empowering than in other ways.
Now, how can colleagues and employers, and this is a two-part question because I don't think it can necessarily be answered in one, but how can both colleagues and employers support employees going through cancer?
I would say on the employer side, making sure that they understand their obligations under the law, which frankly is just the bare minimum of what they're supposed to do. But also then to think about what more could they be doing to be supportive of employees with a cancer diagnosis or even caregivers. And so thinking through, do we want to have policies like employees can donate their hours to each other in moments of crisis, or more flexible work schedules, or other types of policies that just make day-to-day work easier for someone dealing with a serious medical condition. Because I think that those types of employers that are going above and beyond what that bare minimum looks like, it creates a good work environment. And we have the data that shows that employers who are providing those types of policies are where people want to work, and, you know, using accommodations to help people at work. When other employees see that, that improves morale for everybody
Yeah.
because it shows that the employer is supportive.
Well, speaking of accommodations, this again is a two-part question. One is, what does it look like realistically to keep working through treatment? Again, so for someone who's stage one or stage two, maybe even stage three kidney cancer, it's typically surgery, and so that's, you know, a leave to recover. There's still side effects, but they're not, you know, maybe as persistent as if you're on immunotherapy or some type of other targeted therapy. So for people who may be going through immunotherapy or another type of longer term treatment, what does it look like to keep working through that?
If somebody is intending to work through treatment, that still might mean taking a small period of time off work. So if somebody is going to have surgery, it might be a couple of weeks where they're taking time off. So that is about understanding what their options are for doing that. So could they take that time off under the FMLA so they get access to job protection, but maybe they have sick time or vacation time accrued, so they could also take that time off as paid time. So they're getting paid by that accrued leave, but the FMLA is providing that job protection. But for someone who needs to go to follow-up appointments, or there might be days where they're not feeling well due to side effects, they can take time off work in what we call intermittently.
Mhm.
So you can take specific days off under the FMLA, or maybe even you only need a couple of hours off to go to a doctor's appointment. So those smaller segments of time can be used under the FMLA and potentially get paid by taking sick time or vacation time to get paid for that time off. It might also be tapping into disability insurance for shorter periods of time, depending on how long somebody needs to take time off work. But if somebody's trying to manage their side effects while working, that's where accommodations can come in. And reasonable accommodations are any change at work. So it could be a change in schedule, it could be a change in location, it could be a change in a policy, it could be utilizing technology, it might be a more flexible schedule, additional breaks, it could be telecommuting, so working from home. The thing about reasonable accommodations is the law says that it's any change, which means everything's on the table. And you can think as creatively as possible about what solutions are available to help manage those side effects. But it does have to be reasonable based on your job responsibilities. So if you are a school bus driver, telecommuting is not likely to be seen as reasonable, right? So it has to make sense based on what your job responsibilities actually are.
So then can you, and I think you gave some examples, but could you give maybe more specific of what it looks like to manage, let's say, brain fog or fatigue at work, and what I guess an appropriate or reasonable rather accommodation could be for someone who has maybe a knowledge job, or could be maybe what would a school bus driver ask for?
So when you're talking about cognitive function, sometimes it's about the time of day. So sometimes people feel clearer in the morning and are more foggy in the afternoon. Sometimes it's vice versa. So depending on an individual. So if the school bus driver is feeling clearer in the morning, but not in the afternoon, maybe it's a change in schedule so that they're only doing the morning schedule and not the afternoon schedule. So just because somebody works in an environment that maybe isn't a knowledge-based job, or you work at a computer where telecommuting seems like the obvious solution for lots of people, there are lots of potential accommodations that might be available to someone in lots of different types of jobs. And there's actually an entity that is funded by the US Department of Labor called the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN. And their whole purpose is to help employers and employees navigate accommodations. So they have lots of tools on their website, including a solutions finder tool where you can put in the side effects you're experiencing and the types of jobs that you have, and it will show different types of accommodations that people could ask for based on those side effects. And so sometimes it's hard to kind of step back and think, what's actually causing me the challenge at work?
Mm-hmm.
And what could actually be the solution? And we encourage people to come up with a list. Don't just think about one solution, think about all the potential things that could help, because sometimes when you go into the employer and you ask for the accommodation, one of them might not be an option for a variety of reasons. So, but having thought through the backup options not only can help you get to what you actually need, but it also shows the employer you've thought it through and that you're really committed to the process of trying to find the solution. But when you are talking about cognitive challenges that you asked about and types of accommodations, there are schedule changes, as I mentioned, based on when you are feeling strong, but maybe it's about using noise canceling headphones.
Yeah.
So if you sit in an environment that is distracting, noise canceling headphones might be the thing that makes it easier for you to focus. It could be if you're experiencing more focus or short-term memory challenges, being able to take notes in meetings and maybe recording them as a way to have a backup to your notes is something that people don't normally do in your work environment, but being able to record meetings could be something that is helpful. Maybe it's using speak type software in meetings that will actually, or the AI tools that are now available on meetings like Zoom. So thinking through, again, what's posing the challenge and then all the potential things that could be helpful. But I do just want to say that sometimes there are side effects that can actually be addressed through medicine.
Yeah.
So, talking to your healthcare team about the side effects that you're experiencing, there might be a medical solution to those side effects, or using complementary therapies that they could recommend to help address those side effects. But then there are kind of the practical things you can do on your own, like making sure you're taking notes and utilizing technology and meeting reminders and all the kind of tips and tricks that we can do on a practical level. But when somebody needs help from their employer at work to manage those side effects, that's when reasonable accommodations come in.
And going back to the practical, I think for myself, it could even mean like a slow ramp up coming back to work. So for both times that I was on leave, I had a I had a slow ramp up. The first time, actually, my boss at the time encouraged me to even take Fridays off. She's like, you have your vacation days where, it was towards the, I had to use my vacation days up, kind of thing. She's like, you have your vacation days, use them and take Fridays off. Like that's going to be part of your slow ramp up. Because when again, I don't think a lot of people realize this, and this actually goes into my next question. So I'm giving a little aside, and then I'll get to the question. But I don't think people realize when you're having, even if it's an open or a laparoscopic, having an abdominal surgery does take time to recover because you're going through a major muscle and your body's seriously healing. So you need that time. So for myself, like I said, what I needed was like just kind of a slow ramp up and just being able to have a flexible schedule and make my schedule the way I needed to fit whatever I was feeling. Um, but I think though, going back to the abdominal surgery, there's a lot of, like we talked about, a lot of misconceptions about what cancer looks like, both treatment, during treatment, after treatment, whatnot. But what does that look like as discrimination? So what does cancer-related discrimination look like at work, both obvious and subtle?
I think frankly, the most obvious type of discrimination is where you disclose your diagnosis to your employer and your employer says you're fired.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we see obvious discrimination. I think most of the time it's much more subtle.
Yeah.
It's much more of examples where employers are making employment decisions based on somebody's medical condition, but it might not be totally clear that that's what's going on. So, we often say discrimination is about what's going on in somebody else's head. It's not what's going on with you.
Mhm.
So you have to be able to show discrimination, which you can't always do, right?
Yeah.
You might have a feeling that you're being treated differently, but it's a lot harder to prove. So if you have, 15 years of stellar employee evaluations, and then you disclose your diagnosis and your next employee evaluation is horrible, even though your job performance hasn't changed, that might suggest there's something else going on there.
Yeah.
It might be that you don't get promoted or you don't get the next big assignment, or you don't get a bonus so that everybody else gets,
Yeah.
or you might be in a group of people who gets laid off if there's a reduction in force. But then you notice everybody in that group has a medical condition or is a caregiver, or might be older. So there's lots of different types of discrimination. And so it's really often more seen as patterns of
Yeah.
things that demonstrate that employers are taking into consideration your medical condition.
So what steps can someone take if they believe they're being treated unfairly because of their health?
I think it does go back to sort of trying to figure out what's actually going on. Is it coming from a place of ignorance where the employer just had no idea that they were supposed to be complying with certain types of laws, which happens, or is it more intentional? And so trying to get at the heart of why something is happening, I would definitely say is step one. And that does require some communication and talking to somebody at work. And it is specific to the facts of what's going on. But, if you don't get the promotion or you don't get the assignment, talking to whoever made that decision and asking, I'd like to understand better about why I wasn't selected, or is there something that I could be doing differently at work that would make me a better candidate for those? So hearing the responses to those types of questions can help you try to figure out, is what's going
Mm,
on discrimination, or is there something else going on? Maybe I just wasn't the best candidate for that promotion. Which is sometimes hard for us to think about,
yeah.
objectively, but it can help figure out what your next steps might look like. So if it is about the fact that the employer just said, no, we're not accommodating you, maybe that's because they don't understand what you're asking for and that it is an accommodation and that they are required to provide it to you. So in that case, maybe it's calling Jan together
Yeah.
and getting a better understanding of what's possible as an accommodation. And that kind of takes the heat off of the patient employee themselves being the one to teach their employer about the law, but they can hear it from somebody else like Jan. But if somebody feels like they are being discriminated at work, they can file a complaint, either with the state or federal agency that enforces those laws. So at the federal level, that'd be the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. But people should realize that when they file those complaints, it's not confidential. So
Yeah.
it triggers an investigation where the agency then goes back and investigates. So they will interview the employer and they'll interview you and they'll interview other potential people at the place of employment. So if somebody's goal is to stay at work, that might not be the best path forward.
Yeah.
And so that's why, again, understanding the process of how the law applies can help someone make a decision about how to meet their goals at work.
So what other than like Triage and Jan, where are some other places, like other resources that survivors can and patients can look towards for that information or for that support and advocacy?
I think if somebody's trying to understand their rights, they can go specifically to the agencies that provide those or oversee those laws. So the EEOC oversees the ADA, there are state fair employment laws that are overseen by the state fair employment agencies. The Department of Labor oversees the FMLA. But that isn't always easy to navigate those websites and trying to find the right information. So that is frankly why Triage Cancer exists, to try to make that information more easily accessible. And then certainly if somebody has questions, they can contact the navigation program and we will connect them to resources if they need more information or to take next steps like filing a complaint with the agency that is appropriate.
Now, in terms of the last few months, we've had a lot of things happening at the federal level with executive orders that have put some, laws or policies or regulations into questions. Have they impacted our protections or what we have legally, our legal protections as cancer survivors at all? Has there been an impact, or are we, I guess, still good, if you will?
That is a good question, and it's not entirely clear what the answer is at this
Okay.
point because we know there have been changes at the agency level,
Mhm.
even just to staffing. So where protections still exist, whether or not there is enforcement of those protections
Mm.
is in question because, frankly, are there staff there to do that work?
Yeah.
And that's what we're paying very close attention to right now, is to make sure that if somebody does contact the EEOC, for example, that they will get the assistance in filing the complaint and the investigation will move forward. And also information. So websites have been going down, there have been changes to content. And so still making sure that the agencies are also complying with the law is part of what we're paying attention to.
Right, thank you for that. I appreciate, because I know that is a topic and something heavily on people's minds. Now I want to, we have a few minutes left, so I want to turn it to you. What are some things, I guess, that you have been asked about or that you see that are common among survivors and patients who want to continue working or trying to navigate cancer at work, that you've seen and that you think is important to share?
Sometimes people assume that they have more protections than they do. And
Interesting.
so we sometimes get questions like, I've been diagnosed with cancer. My job is protected, right? They can't fire me because I have cancer. And that could be true because they are protected under a law like the FMLA or the ADA, but there isn't a law that says people diagnosed with cancer can't be fired. And so I think that that's an important distinction that sometimes people don't understand. I think also people aren't aware of how the law is limited. So the FMLA only provides 12 weeks. And while it's job protected, it's unpaid. And so that's helpful, but not helpful for many, many people. So where there are opportunities to improve the law, I think people are unaware of those opportunities. I think people lots of times think like, oh, a law just solves the problem.
Yeah.
The law is ever changing, and there are always opportunities to improve the law. So I think that that's one other place that people don't realize is like laws don't solve everything, and that there are opportunities to improve the law, which is why engaging in advocacy is really important.
Now, speaking of law, is there any legislation out there that have been introduced or being pushed for that changes that makes that kind of protection where it says if you are diagnosed with cancer, you can't be fired?
There isn't a proposal that I know of, a legislative proposal to create that kind of protection at the federal level. There have been lots of proposals over the years to improve existing laws. So things like expanding access to the FMLA, making more people eligible for it, creating a paid family leave program. So there are constantly proposals being made at the legislative and policy levels to try to improve these laws, but it does require advocacy. And as you mentioned, we're in an interesting environment right now where I think the advocacy community is really focused on holding its ground.
Yes.
And trying to make sure the protections we currently exist don't go away.
Now, before I let you go, what is one piece of advice or takeaway you want our listeners to go away with after listening to this episode?
I think the one thing that we want people to know is to understand that they have rights. The rights are going to be specific to them and their type of employer and where they live. But then there are also resources to help them understand what their rights are, like Triage Cancer.
Well, and that's perfect. That goes into our sign off. Tell everyone where they can find Triage Cancer.
People can find Triage Cancer at triagecancer.org. And we also have our navigation program where people can sign up for time to talk with us at triagecancer.org/get help.
Well, thank you so much, Joanna, for joining us. You provided such great information that I know so many listeners need right now. So we truly appreciate you being on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Merck, for supporting this episode of the Kidney Cancer Unfiltered podcast. Thanks for listening to Kidney Cancer Unfiltered. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. For more resources and episodes, visit kidneycancer.org or follow Kidney Cancer Association on social media. Until next time, take care, and remember, you're not alone.